Wyoming night was a killer. So cold it stole the sound from the world. So dark it swallowed the moon. And in that cold, in that dark, a shovel bit into the frozen earth. Scrape, thud, scrape, thud. The only sound for miles was Mason Sullivan digging a grave. His breath plumed in the air, a ghost of the life still inside him. He'd chosen this spot for a reason, hidden beneath a snow-heavy pine, far from any trail. This place was sacred. This place was for the dead. But this wasn't a big grave. It didn't need to be. What he was bearing was small. Small but heavier than any man he'd ever carried off a battlefield. He was almost finished when the wind shifted. It carried a sound that had no business being out here. A sharp crack. A rifle. Mason froze, his shovel halfway out of the earth. The sound ripped a hole in the night, and through that hole, Wyoming bled away. For 3 heartbeats, he wasn't in 1873 anymore. He was back in the smoke and the mud of Gettysburg. The screams of dying men filled his ears. The air tasted of copper and gunpowder. He could feel the weight of his Springfield rifle. The cold stock pressed against his cheek as he took aim. "No," he whispered, the word a puff of steam in the icy air. "Not now." He blinked hard, forcing the ghosts back into their graves. The war was 10 years gone, a lifetime ago. This was his penance now. This was his ritual. He set the shovel aside and knelt in the snow. His old Union coat, the blue faded to the color of a thunderhead, was thin against the cold. From an inside pocket, he pulled a small wooden doll. It was no bigger than his palm, carved by his own hand. 2 dots for eyes, a simple line for a mouth. Its arms were held tight to its body, as if it were afraid. He looked down at the tiny figure. "Robert Whitaker," he said, his voice raw from disuse. "May God have mercy on your soul and on mine." He placed the doll in the shallow hole. He covered it with dirt, then brushed the snow over the top, leaving no trace. A grave marked only by memory. He stood and looked at the sky. A billion stars glittered like chips of ice, indifferent to the secrets of men. 17 dolls, 17 souls he carried. 16 were buried now. 1 still remained in his pocket. 1 more soul was waiting. The walk back to his cabin felt longer than usual. By the time the dark shape of it appeared against the pre-dawn sky, his bones ached with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The cabin was his fortress of solitude. Rough logs, a stone chimney puffing a steady stream of smoke into the air. It was the only sign of life in this whole God-forsaken wilderness. And inside, a fire was burning. He had never let it die. Not once in 10 years. Not in the worst blizzards, not during the longest hunts. That fire was the only living thing he allowed himself to care for. It was his one constant, a flickering heart in the center of his empty life. He hung his coat on a peg. The cabin was sparse. 1 table, 1 chair, a narrow cot, and a trunk at its foot. On the mantel above the fire sat a worn Bible, and next to it a single photograph in a simple frame. A young woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to follow him, to judge him, no matter where he stood. He stoked the fire, adding a log. Sparks danced up the chimney like frantic souls escaping to the sky. He wouldn't sleep tonight. He never did after a burial. He would just sit here and wait for the sun and try not to remember. At first light, he saddled his horse and rode toward the only town for 50 miles, Redemption Creek. It was a sorry excuse for a town, just a line of weary buildings huddling against the cold. He usually avoided it, but today he had to see the one man who knew his secret. Dr. Thomas Garrett. The doctor was already awake, as if he'd been expecting him. He was a tall man with a kind face and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much of the world's pain. "It's that time of year again?" Garrett said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. Mason just nodded, stepping into the warmth of the office. It smelled of coffee and antiseptic. "Who was it this time?" Garrett asked, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "Whitaker," Mason said, wrapping his frozen fingers around the warm mug. "Robert Whitaker, the younger one." Garrett nodded slowly. He was the only one who knew about the dolls. The only one who knew why Mason, a decorated war hero, lived like a ghost in the mountains. He was the only one who had seen the list. The list of 17 names Mason kept folded inside his Bible. 17 men who died by his hand, not in the heat of battle, but in a moment of cold, hard choice that haunted his every waking hour. That leaves one, Garrett said softly. Mason's jaw tightened. Yes. And then, he trailed off. And then what? Would the nightmares finally stop? Would the silence in his head finally end? You can't keep punishing yourself, son, the doctor said, his voice full of a pity Mason didn't want. Can I? Mason finished his coffee and stood. He bought his supplies, thanked the doctor, and left. The world could keep its progress. He wanted no part of it. The ride home was a battle against the wind. Snow had started falling again, thick wet flakes that stuck to his eyelashes and melted down his collar. He bowed his head, letting the horse find its way, his mind a perfect, empty blank. He was about halfway home when he heard it, a sound so faint he thought it was the wind whistling through the pines, a thin, hitching noise. He pulled his horse to a stop and listened. There it was again, clearer this time. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a baby crying. Out here, in the middle of a snowstorm, miles from anything. Mason dismounted, his heart pounding a sudden, frantic rhythm against his ribs. He followed the sound, his boots sinking into the fresh snow. The crying was weaker now, but it was joined by a second, equally faint voice. Two of them. There were two babies. He pushed through a stand of trees and stopped dead. Before him was the ruin of an old homestead, its roof caved in. Smoke still curled from the chimney, a final, dying breath. And tied to a post in the yard was a woman. Her head was slumped forward, her dark hair hiding her face. Her dress was torn, her skin a shocking bruised blue against the white snow. Dried blood was caked on her temple. She was either dead or close to it, and at her feet, wrapped in a filthy horse blanket, were two infants. Their tiny faces were pink with cold, their cries so weak they were barely whispers on the wind. Mason approached slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of the hunting knife at his belt. This was wrong, all of it. The woman didn't move. He knelt beside her, his breath catching in his throat. Had he found them too late? Then he saw it, a shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. Ma'am, he said, his voice a rough crackle. Her eyes fluttered open. They were deep brown, clouded with pain, and a cold so profound it seemed to come from her very soul. She looked at him, but it was like looking through him. There was no fear, no hope, just a quiet, chilling acceptance of death. Don't take them, she whispered, her lips barely moving. His knife made short work of the ropes. As the last strand parted, she collapsed forward. He caught her, surprised at how light she was. She felt like a bundle of dry sticks, a hollowed-out thing. They said I wasn't worth feeding, she murmured against his coat, her voice broken. Said girls bring no dowry. Mason looked down at the two infants, who had fallen silent, and were now watching him with wide, dark eyes. Twin girls, barely days old. He gathered them first, carefully tucking the bundled blanket inside his heavy coat, pressing them against the warmth of his chest. Then he lifted the woman. She was unconscious now, a dead weight in his arms. He turned to carry her back to his horse, and that's when the pale winter light hit her face. Mason stopped. He stopped breathing. Those eyes. Even closed, he knew them. That specific shape, slightly upturned at the corners. The same deep brown. He knew those eyes. He saw them every single day. They were the eyes of the woman in the photograph on his mantle. They were Margaret Whitaker's eyes. But that was impossible. Margaret was dead. She had died years ago, just after the war. Garrett himself had told him, this couldn't be happening. It had to be a trick of the light, his guilt-ridden mind playing games with him. But then the woman in his arms stirred, a soft moan of pain escaping her lips. She was real. This was real. Questions would have to wait. They needed warmth. They needed to live. He managed to get them all onto his horse and began the slow, agonizing walk back to his cabin, the deepening snow trying to claim them with every step. You're coming with me, he said to the unconscious woman, the words a promise, a vow. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know how she was connected to the ghosts of his past. He only knew one thing. He had just buried a Whitaker, and now he had found another. By the time they reached the cabin, the world was bathed in the ghostly blue light of twilight. Mason kicked the door open and carried the woman inside, the sudden warmth hitting them like a physical blow. He laid her gently on his own cot, then moved with a frantic energy he hadn't felt in years. He piled logs onto the fire, coaxing it into a roaring blaze. The twins whimpered as he unwrapped them from his coat. Their tiny bodies were trembling, their clothes soaked through. He set them on a blanket near the hearth, their cries weak but insistent. He worked with a grim efficiency born from battlefield triage. He heated water, found clean cloths, and began the delicate process of saving them. He bathed the infants first, his rough, calloused hands terrified of damaging their impossibly fragile skin. They cried, then slowly quieted as the warmth seeped into their chilled bones. The woman was harder. Her dress was frozen stiff, stuck to her skin in places. He had to cut it away, piece by piece, trying to avert his eyes from the story of cruelty written on her body. Bruises, old and new, rope burns on her ankles that matched the ones on her wrists. Her ribs stood out like the slats of a broken cage. He cleaned her wounds as best he could, then wrapped her in his own spare shirt and a heavy quilt. He found the last of his goat's milk, warmed it, and patiently fed the twins, using strips of cloth soaked in the precious liquid. They drank greedily, their tiny fists clenching and unclenching. Only when all three were stable, their breathing even, did Mason finally allow himself to stop. He sank into the single chair at his table, the adrenaline leaving him weak and shaking. He had brought strangers into his sanctuary. After a decade of near-total silence, his cabin was now filled with the sounds of life. A woman and two infants. A woman with Margaret Whitaker's eyes. He stood and walked to the mantel. He picked up the photograph. There she was. Margaret, smiling, standing beside her brother Robert, the man whose doll now lay buried under a pine tree. Margaret, who had written to him after the war, after she learned he was the officer responsible for her brother's death. Her letter hadn't been full of hate. It had been full of questions, full of a grief so profound it had reached across the miles and tightened its fist around his heart. He had never written back, and then he'd heard she was dead. Could this woman be a relative? A cousin he never knew about? The resemblance was too strong to be a coincidence. But grief could make a man see ghosts everywhere. He put the photograph back. The woman on the cot groaned, her brow furrowed with fever. He didn't sleep that night. He kept vigil, moving between the woman and the twins. He spooned water between her cracked lips. He checked her fever. He made sure the blankets around the babies were secure. Sometime near dawn, she woke. Her eyes, cloudy with fever, darted around the unfamiliar cabin, wide with fear. Then they landed on the makeshift cradle by the hearth where her daughters lay sleeping. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a wave of raw, gut-wrenching relief. "You didn't leave us," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Mason, sitting in the shadows, shook his head. She tried to sit up, but a sharp hiss of pain stopped her. She fell back against the pillow, her face pale. "Your babies are safe," Mason said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "They're strong." A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She looked around again, her gaze finally settling on him. "Who are you?" she asked. "Mason Sullivan," he answered, offering nothing more. "Hannah," she replied. "Hannah Whitaker." The name hit him like a physical blow. Whitaker. The same as Robert. The same as Margaret. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was a sign. But of what? A chance at redemption or a new kind of damnation? He kept his face a blank mask, just nodding as if the name meant nothing to him. "My daughters," Hannah continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, "they don't have names yet. I wasn't sure they'd—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The thought was too terrible. Mason stood and moved to the fire, where he'd been heating broth. He poured some into a cup and brought it to her. "They need names now," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "They're going to live." She took the cup, her hands trembling so badly he had to help her guide it to her lips. "How can you be so sure?" Mason looked at the cradle. One of the twins was stirring, a tiny hand waving in the air. "Because they're fighters," he said. "Like their mother." The kindness in his voice seemed to wound her more than the cruelty she'd endured. Her expression crumbled, but she didn't cry. She just drank the broth, her eyes never leaving her children. "They tied me up," she said after a long silence, her voice flat and distant, as if she were telling someone else's story. "After Michael, my husband, was buried. His family. They said twin girls were a curse." Her fingers tightened on the cup, the knuckles white. "They said the cold would take care of their problem." A cold, hard anger ignited in Mason's chest, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade. "Your husband's family did this to you?" Hannah nodded, her eyes hollow. "The Whitakers don't suffer burdens, and women who only birth daughters, we're the worst kind of burden." Mason processed the information, his mind racing. Michael Whitaker, her husband. He wasn't on the list. The Whitakers he knew were Robert and his older brother Ezra. Perhaps she had married into a different branch of the family. The hope that this was all just a terrible coincidence flickered within him. It was a foolish hope, and he knew it. Fate had brought this woman to him for a reason. Hannah drifted back into a feverish sleep soon after. Mason took the cup from her limp hands and went to check on the twins. They were both awake, their dark, intelligent eyes staring up at the ceiling of their new world. The slightly smaller one had worked a hand free from her blanket. Without thinking, Mason offered her his finger. Her tiny hand wrapped around it with a surprising, desperate strength. He felt something inside him crack, a sheet of ice that had been frozen solid for 10 years. He had saved 3 lives. It didn't balance the ledger. 17 taken, 3 saved. The math was still stark, still damning. But maybe it was a start. The next few days fell into a strange, new rhythm. Mason's solitary life was over, replaced by the constant, demanding needs of 3 other human beings. Hannah's fever was a terrible, unpredictable thing. It would spike in the dead of night, leaving her delirious and thrashing in the narrow cot. In her fever dreams, she called out names. Michael, her dead husband. Sarah, a sister maybe. And then she called a name that made the blood freeze in Mason's veins. "Robert," she begged, her voice choked with phantom tears. "Robert, please, don't let them take my babies." The name echoed in the small cabin, a ghost from a decade ago. Robert Whitaker, the man he'd just buried in effigy. It had to be a different Robert. It had to be. The world couldn't be that cruel, that small. When Hannah was lucid, she was quiet, her eyes filled with a deep, weary gratitude that made Mason uncomfortable. He fed her, helped her drink, and brought the twins to her so she could hold them, her thin arms wrapped protectively around their tiny bodies. On the 4th day, Mason rode into town to fetch Dr. Garrett. He couldn't fight this fever alone. The doctor arrived that afternoon, his face grim as he examined Hannah. He clucked his tongue over her bruises and the cracked cheekbone. Then he turned his attention to the twins. "The girls are healthy," he finally pronounced, a smile touching his lips for the first time. "Small, but they're fighters." Hannah let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for days. "And you, Mrs. Whitaker," Garrett said, turning back to her. "You will recover, but you were lucky. Another night in that cold—" He didn't need to finish. He asked to speak with Mason outside. The air was frigid, the sky a dull, unforgiving gray. "She's a Whitaker," Garrett said, his voice low. Mason nodded. "By marriage. Her husband, Michael, died a few weeks ago." "And his family left her to die?" The doctor's face was a mask of disbelief and disgust. "Said twin girls were a curse." Garrett shook his head. "The Whitakers were always a hard bunch. But this is monstrous." He glanced back toward the cabin door. "You know, she has Margaret's eyes." So he hadn't imagined it. "I saw it too." "And something else," Mason said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "During her fever, she called for Robert." Garrett's eyebrows shot up. "Robert Whitaker? He's been dead for 10 years. "I know," Mason said, his voice flat. "I was there." Then she must have meant another Robert, or the fever was playing tricks on her mind. The doctor sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "Be careful, son. You've stepped into something here. The ripples from that war, they haven't stopped spreading yet." He placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. That woman in there could be the daughter of one of the men on your list. The thought was a punch to the gut. All those years, he'd thought of the men he killed as ghosts contained to his memory, to his wooden dolls. He'd never considered the lives they'd left behind, the wives, the sisters, the daughters. What was he supposed to do now? Care for her, Garrett said as if reading his mind. Help her heal, and maybe find out the truth. The truth? What good would that do? If Hannah was Robert Whitaker's daughter, or his niece, then learning that her savior was also her family's killer would only bring more pain. No, it was better not to know. He would help her get strong, and then he would send her on her way, back to whatever family she had left, away from him, away from this place haunted by his sins. When he went back inside, Hannah was awake. She had managed to sit up, and one of the twins was cradled in each of her arms. She looked so small, so fragile, yet so fierce. The doctor says I owe you my life, she said, her voice stronger than it had been, and my daughter's lives. You don't owe me anything, Mason said, busying himself at the fire. He couldn't handle her gratitude. It felt like a lie. Then she said the words that shattered his fragile peace. I saw the photograph on your mantle, she said, her voice hesitant. While you were gone. Mason froze. You know the Whitakers, she stated. It wasn't a question. His throat went dry. I knew some of them. During the war. The war, she repeated, her gaze dropping to her daughters. My father-in-law, he spoke of the war, of the brother he lost at Gettysburg. Mason felt the floor tilt beneath him. He gripped the back of the chair to keep from falling. Your father-in-law? He managed to ask. Robert Whitaker Sr., Hannah said, her eyes meeting his. He died last year. My husband Michael was his only son. Relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed through him. It wasn't the Robert he had killed. It was a different branch of the family. A cousin, an uncle, it didn't matter. The connection was there, but it was once removed. The name she cried out in her fever was for her father-in-law, not the ghost that haunted him. He had been torturing himself for nothing. The woman in the photograph, Hannah said, nodding toward the mantel. Is that Margaret? Robert's sister? Mason nodded, his voice still tight. I never met her, Hannah said softly. Michael told me I reminded him of her. That's why his father accepted me. At first, a shadow passed over her face, until the twins came, and Michael was gone. Then I was just another burden. The pieces were falling into place, but they were forming a picture more terrible than he had imagined. Your father-in-law, Mason said carefully, he let them do this to you? Hannah's face hardened, a spark of anger in her dark eyes. Robert is dead. It was his brother who decided my fate. His brother Ezra. Ezra. The name hit Mason like a freight train. Ezra Whitaker, Robert's older brother, the man who had sent him letter after bitter letter after the war, demanding answers, demanding justice, demanding a piece of Mason's soul. The man whose letters Mason had never answered. Ezra Whitaker, Mason said, the name like gravel in his mouth. He's still alive. Hannah nodded, pulling her daughters closer, as if just speaking his name could harm them. He runs what's left of the family. He has a ranch about 20 miles south of here. She shivered despite the warmth from the fire. And when he finds out we survived, he'll come looking for us. Mason's hand instinctively went to his hip, to the place where his Colt revolver would have been during the war. He hadn't worn a sidearm in 10 years, but he was suddenly thinking he might need one again. Let him come, he said, and the cold, deadly calm in his own voice surprised him. That night, after Hannah and the twins were asleep, Mason sat by the fire, his old Bible open on his lap. Tucked inside was the folded piece of paper with a list of 17 names. 16 of them were crossed out, including Robert Whitaker. Only one name remained, James Collins. But beneath the list, there was another name, a name he had added years ago, not because he had killed the man, but because the man's hate had followed him across a continent. Ezra Whitaker. By some twisted design of fate he couldn't begin to comprehend, Ezra's intended victim was now asleep under his roof, And Ezra's grandnieces, two tiny girls with Margaret Whitaker's eyes, were breathing peacefully by his fire. The world had shrunk. His past had circled all the way around and was now knocking on his door. He stared at Ezra's name for a long time. Then he began to read from the Bible, his voice a low whisper in the quiet cabin. He didn't read the passages about vengeance. He read the ones about mercy, about redemption. He read until the sky began to lighten in the east. And for the first time in a decade, the silence in the cabin didn't feel so heavy. It felt watchful. As the days bled into weeks, the cabin transformed. What was once a tomb of memory became a sanctuary of healing. Hannah's strength returned, a slow but steady tide. The bruises on her soul began to fade along with the ones on her skin. She moved with a quiet purpose, a resilience that astonished Mason. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. And the twins, they thrived. They were tiny miracles, their personalities beginning to bloom like desert flowers after a rain. Mason found himself carving again. Not the grim, identical dolls of the dead, but small, whimsical animals. A bear, a rabbit, a horse with a crooked tail. He was creating, not mourning. The change was so profound it almost frightened him. One night, a blizzard raged outside, throwing snow against the windows like handfuls of sand. Hannah sat near the fire, nursing one of the twins, her face serene in the flickering light. "You know," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've heard you at night, when I'm up with the girls." Mason, who was cleaning his rifle by the hearth, paused. "I hear you reading," she continued, "from your Bible. You always read the same parts, the ones about forgiveness." He didn't look at her. He just kept wiping down the barrel of the gun. "They help," he mumbled, "when the memories get loud." "My husband used to read the Bible," Hannah said, her voice tinged with a bitterness that surprised him. "But he only read the parts about a wife's obedience." She looked at Mason then, her gaze direct and searching. "I prefer your selections." Something shifted in the air between them, an understanding. They were two broken people, finding shelter together in the heart of a storm. They were both haunted, but maybe, just maybe, they could stand guard over each other's ghosts. He felt the need to escape, to be alone with the familiar cold. "I need to check the woodpile," he said, standing abruptly. Outside, the wind howled. He welcomed its fury. It matched the tempest inside him. Hannah was getting too close. She was seeing the things he had buried. The man he had been before the war turned him into a killer and a hermit. He was standing in the lee of the woodshed when he saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing, a shadow, darker than the other shadows, moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal. The movement was too deliberate, too human. He ducked back into the woodshed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited, barely breathing, for 10 long minutes. The shadow did not reappear. It could have been a trick of the swirling snow. It could have been his frayed nerves. But as he gathered an armful of logs and headed back to the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling. They were being watched. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the world clean and white and blindingly bright. Mason was outside splitting firewood when he saw a figure approaching on a mule. It was Reverend Williams, the town's minister. He was a kind, stoic man who had always treated Mason with a respect he didn't feel he deserved. "Dr. Garrett asked me to bring these," the Reverend said, handing Mason a package. "Medicine for Mrs. Whitaker and the little ones." Mason took the package, his eyes scanning the tree line. "You didn't need to come all this way." "The ride does me good," Williams said, his gaze knowing. "And I confess I was curious to meet your guests." Mason hesitated, then nodded toward the cabin. The Reverend spent nearly an hour inside. Mason could hear the low murmur of his voice, and occasionally Hannah's softer replies. He found himself straining to hear, a strange, protective jealousy stirring in his gut. When Williams emerged, his expression was thoughtful. "She has been through a terrible ordeal," he said, joining Mason by the woodpile. "Yet her faith is remarkable." Mason just grunted, bringing his axe down on a log. "She speaks very highly of you, Mr. Sullivan," the Reverend continued. "Says you saved her. Says you read the Bible at night." The axe paused mid-swing. "Is that a crime?" "Quite the opposite," Williams said with a small smile. "I find it interesting. A man who keeps the world at arm's length, yet reads of forgiveness in the dead of night. He fixed Mason with a piercing look. We are all seeking redemption, son. Some of us just take a more difficult road. Before Mason could form a reply, the Reverend was back on his mule riding away, leaving Mason with the unsettling feeling that the old man could see straight through him. When he went back inside, Hannah was humming to the twins, a soft, sweet sound that made the rough cabin feel like a home. The Reverend is a good man, she said. He talks too much, Mason grumbled. A small smile played on her lips. Unlike some people I know. He almost smiled back. The feeling was so unfamiliar he had to turn away and busy himself with the coffee pot. He asked about you, Hannah said, her voice becoming serious. He said the people in town still call you Captain Sullivan. They say you were a hero. Mason's hand tightened on the coffee tin until his knuckles were white. They're wrong. Were you? She pressed gently. A hero? I was commended for taking lives, he said, the words sharp and cold. Not for saving them. Is that why you live out here? She asked, her voice full of a compassion he couldn't bear. Because of what happened in the war? Hannah, he warned, his voice low. She took a step closer. There are things about my past you don't know either, Mason. Things that would make a good man like you turn away. I doubt that, he said, turning to face her. And that's when she dropped the bomb. I found them, she said, her voice barely a whisper. In the trunk, at the foot of your bed. He went cold. The trunk. No one was supposed to look in that trunk. The wooden dolls, she said, her eyes searching his, full of confusion and a dawning horror. Mason, there are 16 of them. Who are they? The blood rushed in his ears. His secret, his penance, his private, decade-long ritual of grief and guilt. She had found it. She had unearthed the very thing he had come to this wilderness to bury. You had no right, he choked out, the words thick with a sudden, suffocating shame. I know, she said, and her voice was so full of sorrow, it broke his heart. I'm sorry, but I have to know. What do they mean? He wanted to yell. He wanted to rage. He wanted to tell her to get out, to leave him to his ghosts. But he looked at her face, at the genuine fear and concern there, and the anger died, replaced by a vast, crushing weariness. He sank into the chair, the one she usually sat in, and buried his face in his hands. He felt a light touch on his shoulder. Whatever this is, she said softly, her hand a small, warm weight against the coarse fabric of his shirt. Whatever burden you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. He looked up at her then. He saw no judgment in her eyes, no disgust, only a deep, quiet empathy. They're the men I killed, he said, the confession ripping from his throat. At Gettysburg, 17 of them. I carve a doll for each one, and on the anniversary of their death, I bury them. Hannah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but she didn't pull away. It's my penance, he whispered, to remember them, all of them. She knelt in front of him, taking his large calloused hands in her own. Mason, she said, her voice thick with emotion, that's not penance, that's a prison. And for the first time in 10 years, in the quiet of his cabin, with the woman he had saved from death, Mason Sullivan felt the sting of tears behind his eyes. He didn't let them fall, but they were there, a frozen river, finally beginning to thaw. February brought a false spring. The snow melted, turning the world to mud, only to freeze again each night. Ezra Whitaker had been quiet, too quiet. Mason knew it was the calm before the storm. He needed supplies, a trip to town he could no longer put off. Bar the door, he told Hannah as he mounted his horse, and keep the rifle close. She stood on the porch, one of the twins in her arms, her face etched with worry. You think he's coming back? I know he is, Mason said. Men like Ezra don't forget, and they don't forgive. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, an unspoken truth passed between them. They were in this together now. Her fight was his fight. Redemption Creek was buzzing with a nervous energy. At the general store, the owner, Jenkins, leaned over the counter, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. Captain Sullivan, you might want to know. Ezra Whitaker was in town yesterday. Mason felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. What did he want? Asking questions, Jenkins said, his eyes wide, about a missing daughter-in-law and two grandnieces. He's offering a reward. Mason's blood ran cold. A reward. That changed everything. Greed could make a man do things fear never could. Who did he talk to? Mason asked, his voice tight. Everyone, Jenkins said. But there's one you should know about. Eleanor Fletcher, the widow who lives east of town. She seemed interested. Mason knew of Eleanor Fletcher, a stern, reclusive woman who dressed in black and kept to herself. She was an unknown quantity, a wild card. Where does she live? He asked. Jenkins gave him the directions, a sly look on his face. Planning a social call, Captain? Mason ignored him, paid for his supplies, and left. He wasn't going back to the cabin. Not yet. He was going to pay a visit to Mrs. Fletcher. Her cabin was neat and tidy, with a bright red door that seemed defiant against the drab landscape. A dozen cats scattered as he approached. Eleanor Fletcher answered the door before he could knock. She was tall and severe with eyes that could chip stone. Captain Sullivan, she said, her voice as crisp as a winter morning. I wondered when you'd show up. What did you tell Ezra Whitaker? Mason asked, getting straight to the point. A flicker of something, amusement, respect, passed over her face. I told him I'd keep an eye out for his missing family. Why? Mason demanded. Why would you help a man like that? She gestured for him to come inside. The cabin was warm and smelled of cinnamon. She moved to a small dresser and took out a tarnished silver picture frame. I lost two daughters once, she said, her voice suddenly losing its hard edge. Twins. A fever took them when they were 4. She showed him the photograph. Two identical little girls in white dresses stared out with solemn eyes. So you see, Captain, she said, her gaze meeting his, sharp and fierce. I have no intention of helping Ezra Whitaker. In fact, I intend to do quite the opposite. Relief washed over Mason. He had found an ally, an unlikely, formidable ally. I want you to tell that young woman, Eleanor said, that she is not alone. And if she ever needs help, the kind of help only another woman can provide, my door is always open. A cold smile touched her lips. Ezra Whitaker doesn't forgive those who cross him. Well, Captain, neither do I. The sun was setting as Mason rode back to his cabin, a new sense of urgency spurring him on. Ezra was closing in. He could feel it. He rounded the final bend in the trail and pulled his horse up short. His blood turned to ice. There were 3 horses tied to his porch rail. He dismounted silently, grabbing his rifle from its scabbard. He crept forward, using the trees for cover. He could hear voices, a man's loud and angry, and Hannah's low and steady. He peered through the pines. 3 men stood on his porch. 2 were hired thugs, their faces hard and mean. And the third was Ezra Whitaker. He had Hannah cornered against the cabin door. She was holding one of the twins, her body a shield, her chin lifted in defiance. Those girls are Whitakers, Ezra was snarling. They belong with their blood. Their blood left them to die, Hannah shot back, her voice ringing with a courage that made Mason's heart swell with pride. You should have died with them, Ezra roared, taking a step toward her. And that's when Mason stepped out of the trees, his rifle leveled. Or what? Mason said, his voice a low, deadly growl. You'll threaten a woman with a baby in her arms? Very brave of you, Ezra. All 3 men spun around, their hands flying to their guns. Ezra's eyes narrowed, recognition dawning on his face. Sullivan, he spat, the name like a curse. Mason Sullivan. Hannah's head whipped around, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. You know each other. We've corresponded, Mason said, his gaze locked on Ezra. Corresponded? Ezra laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. I demanded to know how you murdered my brother. You never answered. The world seemed to stop. Hannah stared at Mason, her face a pale mask of shock. Your brother? She whispered. Robert. He didn't just know him, Ezra sneered, his face contorted with a decade of hate. He killed him, shot him down in cold blood at Gettysburg while he was trying to surrender. The accusation hung in the frozen air, a poison that seeped into everything. Mason saw the dawning horror in Hannah's eyes. The man who had saved her, was the same man who had killed her husband's uncle, the man whose name was a wound in her family's history. "Walk away, Whitaker," Mason said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This ends now." "It ends when I have my blood," Ezra growled. "The girls are coming with me." "No!" Hannah cried, clutching the baby tighter. "We are staying here." "You don't have a choice," Ezra said. He gestured to his men. "Take them." The two thugs started forward. "I wouldn't," Mason warned, the rifle sight settling on the first man's chest. "You killed one Whitaker," Ezra hissed. "Are you going to kill another? In front of his own kin?" The taunt was designed to cripple him, to use his own guilt as a weapon against him. And for a second it worked. He saw Robert Whitaker's face in his mind, saw him fall. But then he looked at Hannah. He saw her terror, her fierce, protective love for her children, and something inside him shifted. This wasn't about the past anymore. This was about the future, their future. "It wasn't murder, Ezra," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "Your brother's commander put sharpshooters behind his own surrendering men. They ambushed us. They killed 14 of my soldiers. I did what I had to do to save the rest." Ezra stared at him, momentarily stunned by the revelation. But the hate in his eyes quickly burned away the surprise. "Lies," he spat. "The lies of a killer." He drew his pistol. The world exploded in sound and motion. Mason fired. One of the thugs went down, screaming, clutching his shoulder. Ezra fired back, the bullet splintering the doorframe next to Mason's head. The other thug raised his rifle. But before he could fire, a third shot rang out, from a direction no one expected, from the direction of the woods. The second thug cried out and fell, his leg buckling beneath him. Everyone froze. Ezra stared in disbelief at his fallen men, then scanned the trees, his face a mask of fury and confusion. "Who's out there?" he roared. "Show yourself!" A figure stepped out from behind a large pine tree, a tall, slender woman dressed in black, a smoking hunting rifle held steady in her hands. It was Eleanor Fletcher. "I believe you were trespassing, Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice as cold and clear as ice. Ezra stared at her, then back at Mason, then at Hannah. He was trapped, outmaneuvered, beaten. A look of pure, venomous hatred twisted his face. He pointed a trembling finger at Mason. "This isn't over, Sullivan," he snarled. "You think you've won? You've just given yourself something to lose." His eyes flicked to Hannah and the baby. "Sleep light, Captain. I'll be back. And next time, I'll burn this whole place to the ground with all of you in it." He turned and limped away, dragging his wounded man with him, disappearing into the twilight. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the baby in Hannah's arms. Mason slowly lowered his rifle, his body trembling with the aftermath of the fight. He looked at Hannah. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with 1,000 unspoken questions. He had saved her again, but he had also just confirmed her family's worst stories. He was the angel of death, the man who had killed Robert Whitaker. He had won the battle, but he was terrifyingly sure he had just lost her. The silence in the cabin was heavier than any blizzard. Eleanor had helped them inside, checked on the twins, and then, with a knowing look at Mason, had quietly taken her leave. Now they were alone, just Mason and Hannah and the terrible truth that lay between them. Hannah stood by the cradle, her back to him, gently rocking her sleeping daughters. Mason stood by the fire, the warmth not touching the ice in his veins. He waited for her to speak, for the anger, for the accusations. When she finally turned, her face was not angry. It was filled with a deep, aching sadness. "The wooden dolls," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Robert was one of them." "Yes," he said, his own voice a hollow echo. "All this time," she continued, her eyes searching his, "you've been living here, punishing yourself. It's what I deserve." "Is it?" She took a step closer. "Did Robert deserve to die?" "No," Mason said, the word torn from him. "He was a boy. They were all just boys." He finally looked at her, letting her see the raw guilt he had hidden for so long. "But it was war, Hannah. It was them or us. I made a choice. And you've been paying for it ever since." She was standing in front of him now, so close he could see the tears shimmering in her eyes. "Every day. For 10 years. He couldn't speak. He could only nod. To his astonishment, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. "You took on my burden without a second thought," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You saved us. You fought for us. You faced down my family for us?" She looked from his face down to their joined hands. Maybe, maybe it's time you let someone help you carry yours." And then, before he could process what was happening, she did something that shattered the last of his defenses. She raised his hand to her lips and gently kissed the scarred, calloused knuckles. A single tear escaped her eye and fell onto his skin. It was warmer than any fire. "You're not a murderer, Mason Sullivan," she whispered. "You're the man who saved my children." Something inside him, a knot of pain and guilt he had carried for a decade, finally, blessedly, began to unravel. The days that followed were a strange mix of vigilance and peace. Mason reinforced the cabin, knowing Ezra would be true to his word. But inside those fortified walls, a new, fragile intimacy was growing between them. They talked, really talked. He told her about the war, about the 17 men, about the crushing weight of command. She told him about her life with Michael, about the stifling expectations of the Whitaker family, about her fears and her dreams for her daughters. They were two ghosts learning to be real again. Then the letter arrived. Reverend Williams brought it, his face grave. It was from Hannah's sister, Sarah, in Chicago. She had finally found out what had happened and was begging Hannah to come live with her. It was an escape, a lifeline, a chance for Hannah and the girls to have a real life, away from the shadow of Ezra Whitaker. It was the right thing to do, and it was tearing Mason apart. "You should go," he said that night, his voice rough. He stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, unable to look at her. "It's not safe for you here, for the girls." "And what about you?" she asked softly. "I'll be fine," he lied. "This is my home." He heard her cross the room to stand behind him. "Is it a home, Mason? Or is it a prison you built for yourself?" He didn't answer. "I won't leave you here," she said, her voice firm. He turned to face her, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. "You have to. I can't ask you to stay. I can't give you the life you and the girls deserve. A life with a man whose hands aren't stained." "What if I'm not asking for that man?" she said, her eyes shining in the firelight. "What if I'm asking for this one? The one who carves animals for my daughters? The one who reads about forgiveness in the dead of night? The one who stands between us and the dark?" She took a deep breath. "Come with us, Mason. Come to Chicago. Let us be your new beginning." The hope that flared in his chest was so bright it was painful. A future? With her? With the twins? A family? It was more than he had ever dared to dream of. But the fear was still there. The ghost of who he was. "I don't know how," he whispered. "I don't know how to be that man." "You don't have to know," she said, placing her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "You just have to be willing to learn. We can learn together." Before he could answer, they heard it. The sound they had been dreading. The thunder of approaching horses. Many of them. And then a bright, hungry orange light flickered outside the window. Mason looked out. The woodshed was on fire. "He's here," Mason said, his voice deadly calm. He grabbed his rifle. "He's come to burn us out. Hannah, get the girls, go to the root cellar. Bar it from the inside and don't come out, no matter what you hear." "No," she cried, grabbing his arm. "I'm not leaving you." "You are," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "You will protect our daughters. That is your fight. This," he gestured to the door, "is mine." He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss full of fear and love and all the things he had never been able to say. "Go," he commanded. "Now." She hesitated for a heartbreaking second, then nodded, her face streaked with tears. She gathered the twins and disappeared through the trapdoor in the floor. Mason barred the main door and moved to the window. He could see them now. Ezra, his leg bandaged, sitting on his horse like a dark king. And with him, at least 10 other men, their faces illuminated by the flames, their rifles gleaming in the firelight. "Sullivan!" Ezra's voice boomed across the clearing. I gave you a chance to die with dignity. Now you'll die like a rat in a trap. The first volley of shots ripped through the cabin walls, splintering wood and shattering the single window. Mason dropped to the floor, crawling to a different position. He was outnumbered, outgunned. This wasn't a fight. It was a slaughter. His slaughter. But as he raised his rifle to the window, he didn't feel fear. He felt a strange, profound sense of peace. He had spent 10 years atoning for the dead. Tonight, he would die protecting the living. It was, he thought, a good death, a clean death. He took aim at the nearest shadow and squeezed the trigger. The battle raged. For every man Mason hit, two more seemed to take his place. Bullets tore the cabin apart around him. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. The fire from the woodshed was spreading, the heat becoming unbearable. He was running low on ammunition. He was bleeding from a dozen cuts from flying splinters. He knew it was the end. He fell back from the window, his rifle empty, and crawled toward the fireplace, his body screaming in protest. He reached up and grabbed the one thing on the mantel he had to protect. The photograph of Margaret Whitaker. He tucked it inside his shirt as a new volley of shots ripped through the door, blowing it off its hinges. Ezra and 3 of his men stormed in, their guns raised. It's over, Sullivan, Ezra sneered, his face a mask of triumphant hate. Mason lay on the floor, gasping for breath, looking up at the man who was about to kill him. He had no more bullets, no more fight left. But as Ezra raised his pistol to deliver the final shot, a sound cut through the roar of the fire, a high, piercing whistle, and then another, and another. Ezra and his men looked around in confusion. Suddenly, from the trees surrounding the cabin, figures emerged, men with rifles. A lot of them. They were the men of Redemption Creek. At their head was Dr. Garrett, his face grim, a shotgun held steady in his hands. Beside him stood Reverend Williams, looking more like an avenging angel than a man of God. And fanned out behind them were a dozen other faces Mason recognized from town. Jenkins, the storekeeper, farmers, ranch hands. They had come. They had all come. Ezra stared, his mouth agape. What is this? He demanded. This, Dr. Garrett said, his voice booming with an authority Mason had never heard before, is justice, Ezra. Ezra's men, seeing they were hopelessly outnumbered, began to lower their weapons. But Ezra was consumed by his rage. He turned his pistol back on Mason. If I'm going to hell, he screamed, I'm taking him with me. He fired, but before the bullet could reach Mason, another body threw itself in the way. It was Hannah. She had come out of the cellar. She stood over Mason, her arms spread wide, a shield of flesh and bone. The bullet caught her in the shoulder. She cried out and crumpled to the floor beside him. Time seemed to stop. The sight of Hannah bleeding, motionless, broke something in Mason. A raw, primal roar of fury erupted from his lungs. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, he launched himself from the floor, ignoring the agony in his body. He slammed into Ezra, sending them both crashing to the ground. His hands found Ezra's throat. His vision was red. All he could see was Hannah's pale face. All he could hear was the sound of her cry. You will not touch her, he roared, his fingers tightening. He was going to kill him. He was going to become the monster Ezra always said he was. Mason, stop! A voice cut through his rage. Dr. Garrett was pulling at his shoulders. Don't do it, son. He's not worth it. She needs you. She needs you. The words pierced the red haze. Hannah. He let go of Ezra, who lay gasping and sputtering on the floor. Mason crawled to Hannah's side. Hannah! He choked out, his hand hovering over her wound. There was so much blood. Her eyes fluttered open. Mason, she whispered, a weak smile touching her lips. I told you. I wasn't leaving you. Stay with me, he begged, tears finally streaming down his face, washing away a decade of dust and grief. Please, Hannah, stay with me. Dr. Garrett was there, tearing away the fabric of her dress, pressing a cloth to the wound. The bullet went clean through. She's lost a lot of blood, but she's strong. She'll make it. The men of Redemption Creek were rounding up Ezra and his crew. The fire was being fought. The nightmare was ending. Mason knelt there on the floor of his ruined cabin, holding Hannah's hand, her lifeblood staining his own. The twins were safe. Hannah was alive. And he finally understood. Redemption wasn't something you found by burying the past. It was something you built. In the ashes of who you were, you built a future, you built a home, you built a family, and you fought for it with everything you had. Months later, the sun shone on a new cabin, built on the foundations of the old one, with the help of every able-bodied man in Redemption Creek. Hannah, her arm in a sling but her smile bright and whole, sat on the porch, watching Faith and Grace take their first wobbly steps in the grass. Mason stood beside her, his hand resting on her good shoulder. The nightmares were gone. The silence in his head had been replaced by the sound of his daughter's laughter. He still had the dolls. They sat in a box on the new mantel, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the cost of hate and the power of love. He was no longer Captain Sullivan, the angel of death. He was Mason, a husband and a father, a man who had walked through hell and found his heaven, not in the next life, but in this one. He had finally found his redemption, not in the cold, lonely earth of Wyoming, but in the warmth of his new family, in the eyes of the woman who had seen the monster inside him and had loved him anyway. If this story of redemption moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because you won't want to miss the incredible stories of survival and hope we uncover next. And let us know in the comments, what do you think true redemption really means? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe out there.